Hi, welcome back. This is not the final moment, but the last but one moment of this conference. And the aim is based on the discussions of the previous panels to single out weaknesses and possible solutions for democratic development. So it is not a light task that we have, and I have the task to chair and moderate this panel with participants to the panel Philippe Schmitter, Thomas Carothers, Elena Pavan, and Ethan Zuckerman. I just wanted to make a couple of remarks to which I hope you can also refer to in your presentation. I think in general, as comments on the development of the discussions, I think that what it shows is the need for two elements in our research practices. One is to attempt to develop holistic visions which go beyond the disciplinary type of distinctions. Wolfgang Streeck once said, in this moment of big transformations in the capitalist crisis, we need approaches in which different types of perspectives are bridged. And I think that this, our discussions also testifies for the needs to go beyond the traditional separations in the social sciences and to have more interactions between people talking on social movements, on party politics, on social media in order to approach democratic transformations. And another aspect is the need for more cross-area interactions. We tend to develop our hypotheses very often on the basis of a limited knowledge of a limited part of the world. And I think these were some general remarks about the main questions. What I single out as questions which have been emerging from all the three discussions is the ones I called the questions of the democratic agent, the questions of the democratic differences, and the questions of the democratic misfit. And about the first, it's an issue which we started to discuss also on the basis of the interventions of Philippe a few hours ago. He said in the past the labor movement has been the agent of transformations. Do we have some alternatives? A few days ago, we were with Philippe attending a lecture by a common friend, Guy Standing, who was talking about the proletariat as
precariat.
Excuse me, the precariat. In fact, as the alternative to the proletarian. Maybe it was too optimistic, but I think that there is an issue which has been addressed by many of the panels, and it is the generational issues which is related also with the social issues. So the fact that some of the transformations in democracies have been introduced as challenges and solutions by young people who have felt to have been excluded by these societies. To which extent this could be the basis of democratic agencies in transformations, in finding the solutions for the democratic challenge, I think is an open aspect. Also, to which extent the alliances can be built around the precariat, which is very often not only the say the young people without positions in the labor market, but very often also the people who have been excluded by the labor market, the socially marginal. Second, democratic differences. I think that we have discussed a lot from the different perspectives, singling out common challenges, but also the ways in which these common challenges have been embedded in different histories with democracies and different histories in general. How these differences affect both our visions of what is going on in the democratic world and the type of different scenarios which have been built, I think is another issue worth reflecting upon. And a very final point, democratic misfit. We have been discussing especially about conditions which affect nation states, which however are no longer dominant actors in democratic governance. We are all watching in the internet, waiting for the result of the Brexit. It's just one of the examples of the ways in which what we once considered to be international politics is now instead very much embedded in the destiny of our own democracies. So without taking more time to the panelists, I will ask Philippe if he wants to address some of these questions.
Well, let me start with none other than Robert Dahl, who's made the point that democracy is a moving target, that it has transformed itself several times. He had three transformations in mind: size, scope, and scale. I won't go into the details, but for a long period of time, at least, until nobody believed that democracy was an appropriate form of government for anything but a city-state and a few Swiss cantons. I mean, it was obvious. So obviously something changed, and representation is part of it. Federalism, there are other devices. Okay. I think we're in the middle of another set of, he called them revolutions, so we are in a revolutionary context according to Dahl. You have to understand that he did not understand revolutions as violent, necessarily violent. In fact, his revolutions occurred without revolutionaries. That is, people who just simply responded pragmatically to various kinds of opportunities and changed the basic institutions of democracy. Now, I won't go into, and again, I've written about this. So the big problem today is that in previous transformations of democracy, they were done sequentially, and each transformation contributed to the next transformation. Today, we have what we call the dilemma of simultaneity. We have many, many important changes in the practice of politics going on in the same time, the same place, the same frame, let's say, which makes it, of course, very difficult to understand the outcome. So the unpredictability, the sheer unpredictability of politics has increased dramatically. We see this parenthetically in the declining capacity of survey research to explain who's going to win an election. So, and there's a reason for this. It's not just that the technique is bad, it's also that people don't make up their mind until the last minute, and they don't know how, in a sense. They're not guided sufficiently by previous memberships and loyalties and the like. So we have this problem of simultaneity. As I understand the purpose of these panels is, can democracy be transformed by consent? Because we begin with the assumption that we live in post-revolutionary times, so we cannot do it by violence. So it will have to be done by some form of negotiation, deliberation, mixture of the two, whatever, but presumably by consent. And then the second question for our particular panel was, will political parties in elections be part of that process, or will they be obstacles to that process? I'm not saying I have an answer for this, but the real, as I say, historically, the first thing you want to know is that democracy transformed itself because it was threatened. So you had to have an agent, a threatening agent, and those were usually people who were excluded from it, or the military in some cases. I mean, there's a whole long list of agents that have been threatened, and in some cases successfully, democracy, right? So you need to begin with, I think, an analysis, which I haven't heard very much. What is is there a threat? The problem is there is threats in the plural rather than a clearly identifiable agent, a counter-democratic, anti-democratic agent that you can focus on and therefore focus your reform efforts on that. So historically, you had to have three elements to produce transformations of the type I think that John will be interested in, and we're supposedly interested. The first is you had to have this agent capable of significant collective action. We heard the talk the other day by Guy standing, and he has developed this concept of the precariat. So the proletariat doesn't exist anymore. We now have the precariat. And in sheer numbers, it's a very impressive quantity. That is the number of people who are precarious in employment and all sorts of other human conditions, housing, everything you can imagine, right? So there's a large percentage of the population out of there which is precarious, living in precarious circumstances. Do they constitute an agent? That is to say, are they capable of acting collectively? I doubt it. But anyway, they're certainly excluded from the labor market, but also very largely from the political market, so to speak. So we need to think about this question of an agent. And there are plenty of people who are excluded from the present-day democratic process. In fact, I would say even perhaps a majority of the people feel that those who are ruling in the name of democracy for them aren't paying any attention to them. I mean, that's a fairly widely distributed, but that's not enough to produce an agent, right? Now, it might if they were to organize as a political party, maybe as a social movement, so we could, but that's, as I see the problem, there are plenty of potentially excluded people or who feel excluded, but the problem is that of collective organizing these people to express themselves. As it is now, they vote for populist parties, which is, anyway. Oh, yes, I forgot there's one other thing. I was just reading this essay the other day. Max Weber in Politics as a Profession. Weber had an idea. It was a terrible idea. It actually destroyed democracy. He thought it would be charismatic leadership. So the agent is the charismatic leader. Donald Trump. Marine Le Pen. I don't know. Pepe Grillo. I mean, okay, but his idea was that democracy would be successively enclosed in what he called the iron cage of rationalization, bureaucratization, etc. So he had a different kind of scenario, but still, the only way you would break out of the iron cage would be some kind of, now guess who came along after Max Weber in Germany, but also first in Italy, then in Germany, was exactly that kind of agent, if you wish. So I don't put a great deal of positive hope on this, but it was an idea. That is, you wouldn't necessarily have a pre-existing collective agent, but you would have someone who would produce that agent, right? Create a following or whatever. And that's exactly what happened in the 1930s. Right. Second, you need an ideology. You need a vision of what an alternative democracy would look like. The problem very often is, yes, people have partial visions of how the electoral system could be improved or whatever. I mean, there are all these, the kinds of ones we also thought up in that book for the Council of Europe. But is it together a significant, convincing image of an alternative future type of democracy. And the word we use for it, of course, is post-liberal, not anti-liberal, but post-liberal, right? So, but what does that mean? Can we imagine a plausible scenario of changes in existing institutions which is significantly comprehensive and coherent so that we could sell it to the public, so to speak? And then finally, you need a mechanism. And that's, of course, one of the things that's missing. The mechanism in the past was a threat of revolution. You change democracy because if you didn't change it, you would end up being in an autocracy of some kind or another. And so, unfortunately, the specter of revolution has disappeared. We have the reality of repeated rebellions, revolts, or whatever it is. That happens almost every day, but that's not sufficient to concentrate the effort on some kind of alternative institutional structure. What the message I heard from here is that we are unfortunately in a situation not only where those three items are not coming together. They could, right? But they're not. But, and this I think is particularly came across to my thinking when we were talking about information communications technology, ICT. In this, I got also the idea, I'm stealing this idea from Pierre Rosanvallon in his book on la contre-démocratie. Mm-hmm. And what Pierre argues is that this social movement activity organized and provided with the incentives of this new technology, making it much less costly and blah, 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 so that you have a lot of virtual mobilization, is that it's a powerful negative agent, but it's extremely weak as a positive agent. And it seems to me that's a serious problem. That is, it will undo democracy, or at least democracy as we know it, what I call real existing democracy, but it will not provide either the ideology, the agent, or the justification for a new democracy. That's not a good scenario in my view, and I don't know what else we can do about it, but I invite more positively minded people on this panel to address that question. Okay.
I had a similar debate a few days ago with another mutual friend, Wolfgang Streeck. And after long discussions, we agreed on the fact that it took a long time to the working class to invent new ways. And that's what we are looking at now.
We live in very compressed times.
Yeah, it could accelerate, but
yes.
And so, to which extent this is could be a sort of prefiguration, experimentation with different type of agent ideology and mechanisms, I think still is open for next conference to debate. And Tom, do you want also to address some of these questions?
Yeah. I guess final sessions are useful because everyone maybe relaxes a little bit, and I didn't really prepare much for this last session. I was supposed to listen to what happened and make a few comments, and I was trying to jot down a few ideas, and well, they're not very coherent. So you'll have to bear with me. I'm usually fairly organized when I present. You know, recently I stepped outside the door of the Carnegie Endowment where I work, and I ran into somebody I hadn't seen. It must have been 15 years, and he looked at me and he said, "Oh, Tom, I feel really bad for you." And I thought, does he know something I don't about my life or about me? And do I look that bad? I thought after 15 years, he looked pretty bad. You know how when you run into someone you haven't seen in 15 years and you always think, I'm glad I don't look that bad. But he said, democracy, you know, isn't that your thing? You know, democracy. And he says, I just feel terrible for, you know, you must feel depressed all the time. And so I want to reflect on that a little bit. I mean, I think first with respect to sort of tend to focus a lot on democracy in the non-Western world. In the Western world, I think if you sort of think, why are we so depressed in a way? First, I'm not usually an economic determinist, but something has happened in that from the mid-1940s through, can't really pinpoint it exactly, sometime in the 1980s maybe, the West enjoyed a remarkable economic expansion, and democracy benefited a lot. Because as we know, citizens are in a continual state of confusion over whether democracy is a political system that's supposed to produce representation and responsiveness of government, or is it just supposed to deliver the goods? And when it doesn't deliver the goods, citizens say, quote, democracy is not working. But that's a confusion. But in the last 20 years, democracy, we have the stagnation of, the wages or the economic situation of many people in the United States. And in Europe, of course, we have persistent low growth, no growth economies. And in some ways, a lot of the democratic malaise is fairly simply attributed to that fact. It's an economic fact. And that isn't really, quote, that much to do with democracy. It has to do with the evolution of the global economy and the fact of rebalancing of power in the global economy and the arrival of Asia in the global economy and a number of other things. And so it's funny in a way that democracy's, getting the heat for something that may or may not really be its fault. But that's inescapable because that's what citizens want. And certainly if you look at, what's happening in the United States this year and its electoral campaign, a lot of the inchoate anger in the system is economically rooted, although it has other roots as well, which I'll try to talk a little bit about. But in Europe as well, the unresponsiveness of the political systems to be able to solve this basic economic problem of economic stagnation in Europe has put democracy in trouble. So that's, one way you could look at it and just say, maybe it's a bit simpler, that we shouldn't be focusing so much on the forms of democracy, because that's not going to do it if the underlying economic problem isn't solved. Or you could go into other factors, which are different, which Philippe and I were talking a bit about lunch, is the fact that, Western democracy was based on a fairly simple idea of political representation around a center-left and a center-right, which was rooted in an industrial society in which you had kind of an owner class and a worker class. And they created a natural balance between unions and owners, and that created a coherence in political representation and parties and so forth. In the last 30 or 40 years, our societies have moved away from that form of organization, and we're now in a kind of post-industrial organization society that's leading to a lot of confusion politically because parties no longer correspond to this. And so that citizens have multiple identities and cleavages, and they naturally the representational system has gotten very mixed up. And if you add technology to that in the sense that the very daily nature of life is changing and citizens are able to connect with each other in different ways and spend time, outside of, formal institutions and create lives for themselves that are apart from that, they just want something different from the political system. They may not want politics. And when we puzzle over youth disenfranchisement, it's not just because old people are controlling the political system. They're busy doing other things. They're engaged in some other forms of life that just don't connect very much in most cases. So yet there's a whole other way of thinking about this democratic malaise we're facing. Third thing I'll say about that is we really are living, and Philippe also, is harking to this, we are living in an age of the puzzle of gradualism, in that the United States, you feel this very acutely. We have a political system that cannot reform its basic rules. We can't change the electoral college rule. We can't seem to change gerrymandering. We can't even change campaign financing. We can't change the fact that we vote on Tuesdays, which is a ridiculous day to vote, and any rational person would have you vote on a non-working day. We can't change anything in this because everything is reified. We have a constitution that has been reified, and it's that. I know Ben, mentioned this earlier as a non-American living in America, and a political science who's really into reforms. It kind of drives you crazy. Here's a big, modern, effective democracy that can't reform anything. It can't. The smallest thing is untouchable. And so, again, the elections this year reflect the fact of a political system, the party system, which can't somehow be reformed in various ways. We can't, for example, change the rules that would make it possible for a third-party candidate to really have a chance. There's a movement for that in the United States, but it's closed out over simple things like the rules about debates, whether third-party candidates get to participate in debates. So as a result, you have two parties that, have produced candidates that are deeply unpopular by large numbers of people, yet you can't have an entry of in a new party. And so the system's stuck, and you have the churning in both parties. Yet it's as though you have a frozen system and a churning society, and it's leading to that. So gradualism versus abrupt change, yet if you try to do a thought experiment and say, what would abrupt change look like in the United States, your mind just stops. You just don't even know what it would look like. Or even in almost any Western democracy. I mean, Spain and maybe Greece, a couple have gotten closer to abrupt or more radical change. But it's the West, in a sense, looking at the two factors I started with, talking about the overall economic change and then the overall change in sort of identities and cleavages in society. It's like, maybe the Titanic is sinking slowly, and we can't imagine abrupt change until something really sharp occurs. So that makes you look around the world elsewhere and say, well, where is abrupt changing occurring elsewhere? And what you do see, if you do a simple study, I did this recently, the last 20 regime changes that occurred in the world in the last 10 years, as I count them, 11 of them occurred because of large-scale protests about corruption. Brazil is experiencing this recently. Guatemala experienced that, driving a president out. Romania has had a form of that in recent years. And there have been quite a few others. You could count, I think, Tunisia and Egypt in that, although they worked out in different ways and so forth. And so there certainly are places where people are breaking out in large numbers and pulling down a political elite. But they're doing so around a fairly simple idea, which is, Yvonne Krostov would say, is both a specific idea about corruption, but almost a metaphor for I'm unhappy. You are corrupt because you're not delivering this. You seem to be doing better than me, and a whole series of things that make me call you corrupt. So we are seeing, changes, but they're not revolutionary change around political ideas, and that's what Philippe is also harking to. We do live in an age in which there are no revolutionary political ideas. You could call anti-corruption a political idea, but it's not really. It's really simply saying I'm angry and you're bad, and I want to get bad people out of power and put good people in. So we do live in this age of a lack of any real driving political ideas. Two other things I would say is there's a lot of talk about democratic stagnation or recession in the world. It's true that, democracies are not increasing in numbers, and we are in a fairly not a period of expansion like we were in the 80s and 90s. But when you look at the non-Western world, it's a really mixed picture, and there isn't a pervasive democratic malaise in the same way. There are a number of major countries like Indonesia or even India that they're not, I wouldn't say thriving as democracies, but they're not in a state of really, pervasive democratic malaise. I would say the same is true of many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. There are countries like, Burkina Faso that are having breakthroughs in many places. Latin America is having a surprising kind of, it's crawling through a very difficult decade, and it's facing low commodity price, but it's struggling, but systems are holding together and trying to renovate themselves through electoral processes. And so the feeling that the fellow outside Carnegie had talking to me isn't shared by many people, and we do have to be careful. This conference has been a bit ambiguous about, are we talking about democracy just in Europe and North America, or are we talking about democracy more generally? We have to be careful not to overgeneralize about that. Then finally, I would say we haven't also talked very much in the meetings today about what I see a lot in the world, which is a lowering of barriers across borders for political influence. And there's a very great heterogeneity of political influences across borders now. And we are still in the West operating often with an idea of a directionality going out from Europe and North America out to the world, and that there's still a source of sort of civilization and success beaming out to the world. And it's not like that anymore at all. I wrote an article in January in Foreign Policy called Look Homeward, Democracy Promoter, where I posed the basic question that the U.S. democracy promotion community was built on the assumption of democratic success in the United States and struggle elsewhere, and that people go from the United States elsewhere with lessons and messages and wisdom. And it's now, if somebody from the International Republican Institute goes to another country and says, let me talk about party building, what's the reaction of that person supposed to be, other than hilarity? I'm glad you're here. No, I'm serious. It's sort of funny, but it's actually not that funny anymore. And it's not just the poor International Republican Institute. Any American going abroad saying you have a problem with, credibility of citizens in your electoral system. You have a problem with institutional gridlock. You have a problem with non-parliament, parliament that doesn't function. You have a problem with credibility of your main political parties. You have a problem of, this, and this. What kind of conversation is that, you know? I actually think it's a great moment of hope for the assistance community, because I think the assistance community's fatal flaw was thinking that assistance is bringing knowledge from one place to another, and that actually I think assistance is about facilitating change through being smart about change. And this is an opportunity. You have to give up the conceit that helping people is that I know something and you don't. Helping people means getting together and trying to work together and learn together and see how we can activate change. And so I think this is actually potentially a moment where the assistance community transforms itself, and I think all assistance organizations are struggling with that. So those are a few reflections, a bit incoherent, but at least some broad thoughts at the end of the day.
Thank you. I would like to pick up two issues which I think is worth debating. One is some assumptions in your first statement that the economic crisis is something which is detached from democracy. It's not the responsibility of democracies. While some other visions say it is this type of democracies that has produced this crisis. Both the general financial crisis has been linked with political responsibilities, and in Europe, the shift from the beginning of the crisis to the generalizations of the crisis has been also very much related with the political decisions by democratic institutions. And so questions is how and which responsibilities link the market and the state. Another questions which I think is important to address is that there is, I see over and over again, this tendency to see the actors which are moving in the societies as anti-political, anti-systemic, antagonistic, and so on. I'm angry, I'm hungry, but for instance, you say about corruption, they're angry about corruption, but don't say anything. On the other hand, research on social movements tend to say these actors tend to create knowledge, and this is one point of Elena, and so in giving her the floor, I also would like to ask to address against these questions. Is it that these people are just crying in the street, or how can we see which type of contributions they give in terms of ideas?
Wow. So I don't know. So it's overrated, but it's hard to answer to this question, and it's harder for me because I'm always trying to, I'm obsessed with making sense because it's my job, but I do this job because it's me, it's my personality. I'm always trying, to make an order and to give an order, and so I don't know if it's the democracy who has produced a certain type of market which then went to crisis, and then it reflected back on the democracy. The truth is that I think that there is no space in society where that can be ignored. Because, as I said this morning, everyone is a knowledge producer. And there is no good knowledge or bad knowledge. There is knowledge. There is something that is believed to be true and that it's put forward in the public discussion as believed to be true for some specific reason. The point is, when someone cries because they say, I'm hungry or I'm angry, they have a reason and they have benchmark towards this. The worthiness of this claim can be measured. And I hate to insist, but the very benchmark of democracy is the respect for the human person. So if someone is hungry, that is not fair. And if it's not fair, it deserves to be taken upon. It needs to be contrasted. If personal freedom are violated, then an action has to be taken. How do we do this? I mean, it's been hard so far to provide an answer because I think that we have a very clear image now at the end of this day that lots of things are not working. And so when I was invited to work to talk on this panel, and I saw the task that was summarize the problems and propose a solution, I was like, I don't know. And then after discussing with everybody today, which put forward the premise, I'm going to be very pessimistic here, and I leave the optimism to the other people. It's been even harder because in the end, we have the perception that something is not working. We don't know where to go, and I really certainly don't have the answer, but I want to, somehow we managed to arrive to this point of the discussion today without mentioning one word, which has been like the mantra in the last few years of political reform, which has been networks. So I don't know how we made it until this point today without talking seriously about networks, but I think that if a solution has to be found, then the solution can start by taking networks seriously. Because it is within a network that a complaint is framed and then gets organized and becomes a collective expression of dissent. It is within networks that state can overcome their lack of expertise or knowledge or competences and find innovative governance arrangement. It is within the network that the social movement get organized. And networks are incredibly powerful, but they need to be taken seriously, because if they're just used metaphorically, then, the metaphor, once that you have explained the complexity, it just has done its task and it stops being useful. But networks are tools that we can use to think and be like a very useful entry point to reflect on what is going on. And networks are very flexible, and they're a very good way of depicting complexity, but they're not complicated, because in the end, every network that you can think of is always made of two elements, the nodes and the ties. And surprisingly, whereas democracy so far has been counting the heads, or rhetorically depicted as counting the head, the unit of analysis in network analysis is the tie and not the node. So the key to the network metaphor, or rethinking of democracy, is that being present is not enough. It's the type of connections that you have that gives you power and actually give other people power. So networks, especially communication networks today, are places in which the power of voice can be exerted to an unprecedented extent. But also the power of exit is important, because if I leave the network, I might be very peripheral in that network, but in breaking up my ties, I somehow subtract the power that I'm giving to other people with my ties. It's a metaphor. It's a tool for handling interdependency. And so if someone at some point, I don't know, through a political party, or I don't know if in a less institutionalized informal platforms or coalitions or subcultures, elaborate an alternative vision, this vision has to be contextualized within a very complex network and judged with what good networks have gained over time, defeating bad networks. Because coming back to what we were discussing this morning, social movement have achieved great results, always defeating the bad guys. So here I am trying to be very positive. I think that we have reached a point in which the situation is very difficult, but if we really begin to think seriously that we act in a context, and that this context has boundaries that are not to be negotiated any longer. That power is not absolute, but it's relational. I give, and in giving I receive power. Then I think that alternative ways to make democracy work can be found. Then there's a lot of things that I don't know how to handle. But I think this is a useful entry point, and maybe in 5 years, like Stefania, will have another answer, like more precise, but I don't want to play the card of time. But I think that starting from here could be a useful starting point.
Thank you. Well,
Sure.
also some possible solutions.
I'll come out of this with a note of optimism because I suspect we all desperately need it. I have the opposite of Tom's problem. I had over-prepared for this, and I had a slide deck and a whole prepared talk, and it's just the wrong thing to do for you guys at 5:45. So I'm just going to put the notes to the side and hope for the best. And I'm going to start with a story, and the story is from September of last year. I was in Ghana, West Africa, as I often am, and I was meeting with bloggers, as I often do, and I was particularly interested in one of the people in this group of about 24 young Ghanaians, because I'd been in touch with him online. I followed him on Twitter. It's a guy named Efodela, and I knew one thing about Efodela, which was that he'd been a very successful organizer in a protest in Accra called Dumsor. Dumsor is Chui for on-off, and what's happening to the electric grid in Ghana right now is it keeps going on and off. And it's going on and off through a couple of factors. Climate change is one of them. Ghana is mostly powered by hydropower, and they haven't had the rains that they've needed. But the other one is that Ghana's now a middle-income nation. And there's a lot of people in cities like Accra and Kumasi and Takoradi who've got air conditioners and who've got TVs, and they really want the power to stay on, because once you get used to air conditioning, it's really hard to live without it. So this guy, Efodela, helped mobilize a march of about 5,000 people from the outskirts of Accra into Black Star Square, sort of the central part of the city. And this was a really well-organized march. I mean, people had T-shirts with hashtags that said Dumsor must stop. They figured out the right symbol for the movement. People were carrying kerosene lanterns, which is a great way of sort of symbolizing don't take us back to the kerosene days. And so I have the chance to talk with Efo, and I say, Efo, what's the tool that people use in Ghana for online political organizing? I mean, like when you try to get people out in the streets, is it Facebook? Is it Twitter? Is it any of these sort of person-to-person services? What do you use for political organizing? And Efo looks at me and goes, whoa, 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 whoa. I'm not political. Now, I work in a lot of places where I'm not political means, please stop talking about this, I'd prefer not to get arrested. But that's not Ghana. Like, Ghana's an incredibly open society. It's got a free press. It's had successful elections the last 5 cycles running. He actually meant something really different, and it was this. If you are political in Ghana, you are an idiot. You are just really dumb to believe that either the NPP or the NDC is going to get anything done. And if you're under, let's say, 30 years old, you want nothing to do with those guys. Like to the point where Efo won't take photographs with people who are tightly associated either with NDC or NPP. Politics is something for older people. Politics is something for people who do it professionally. But it's not something you would do if you actually wanted to make change. So I came out of this a little freaked out, but I started thinking about this and realizing that this anti-political tendency was not something I was just seeing in Ghana. I actually see it all over the place. I see it in my friends in Russia who ended up building the Rinda project, which essentially said, look, we can't do anything about Putin, but maybe we can do person-to-person organizing to provide social services on a peer-to-peer basis. I see it with my friends in India who put together I Paid a Bribe, who essentially say, I don't know that we can take on corruption, but we can document it, we can find ways around it that way. I see it in Nigeria where people start building the Enough is Enough movement, or again around electric power, but explicitly apolitical, explicitly trying to figure out how to pressure any different political leader to make progress on this issue. And I want to suggest that I actually think what's going on in the United States right now is all about anti-politics. I think both the strength of Trump and the incredible strength of Bernie Sanders, who, if you'd asked anybody a year ago, is a 73-year-old socialist, a viable candidate for president of the United States, you know, they would have laughed at you. But the answer is right now, there are so many people in my country who are alienated and frustrated that actually standing up and identifying yourself as being outside of these existing democratic institutions is probably the smartest electoral strategy that you could have. So I want to do two things. I actually want to be slightly more precise about what I think is going on, and then I want to suggest that I actually think there's a way around it. I think this is not just a distaste for politics. I actually think it's a distaste for institutions. I think it's a widespread mistrust in anything that is large enough that we deal with it as an institutional bureaucracy rather than as a collection of individuals. So I'm not going to get pinned down on is it 500 people or 2,000 people, but there's a big difference between an individual and institution. In the US, people always love their congresspeople. They can't stand Congress. It's the least popular thing. And in some ways, it's a difference between dealing with a large entity and dealing with an individual human. Similarly, people have good experiences with companies. They don't trust businesses as a whole. And we've got good statistical backup on this. Trust in government, answering the question, do you trust the government in Washington to do the right thing all or most of the time, peaked at 77% in 1964. And it's had a long gradual slide down to about 15% right now. You can find about 15% of Americans who will tell you that the government will do the right thing all or most of the time. When you expand this question out and say, do you trust this institution to do the right thing all or most of the time, we've seen huge falls in trust in the healthcare system, in banks, in business, in the police, in churches. You go across the board for institutions, there's been a major fall in trust. The only two institutions in the United States where there's been increased trust since the 1980s are small business and the military. And then if you expand this out and you look at some of the work that Edelman has done with the Eurobarometer survey, it's not universal across the board in Europe. But you see a lot of rising mistrust, and not just government mistrust, mistrust in broader swaths of society. In Southern Europe, in good chunks of Western Europe, not so much in Northern Europe. Germany and the Scandinavian countries seem to be largely immune from this. Most authoritarian countries seem to be immune from this. China, UAE, Singapore actually come up as very, very high trust, but democracies in many cases come up as extremely low trust. Here is the challenge for me. I don't work on democratic systems. I work with activists. That's my job. I do technology and social change. I try to help activists be more efficient. Activists right now have a really interesting problem around mistrust, which is that two of the major things we know how to do in civics just don't work very well right now. We know how to elect good people to office and ask them to pass laws and enforce them. But if you have a 9% trust in Congress, it's really hard to believe that that's going to be the way that you're most effective at having change. So Tom talked about these sort of calcified systems. It seems really hard to even do common sense reforms. It's even harder to mobilize a 25-year-old and say, this is what you should work on. You should work on electing someone so they can go to Congress and pass some reforms. It's not a good motivator. Weirdly, the other thing that's getting defanged a little bit is protest, because you end up usually protesting an institution because you want the institution to do something. Let me take you to the United States right now. We had a set of our senators sit down on the floor to have a sit-in in the hopes that they could actually have a vote on gun control legislation after 49 people got brutally murdered a little bit more than a week ago. The other party left. I mean, if my senators can't successfully protest, how do I expect that I'm going to go and march and protest? So these two forms of civic engagement that we know a lot about aren't working so well right now. Or maybe they're working well and people don't believe they're working well. It's very, very hard to make the case to young people that these are the ways to go. Here's what I see young people doing. I see people engaging in civics, but not in politics. And I see them doing it primarily through three different means. I see them working with markets, I see them working with technology, and I see them working with social norms. And I'm going to go over these really, really fast, but I think these are levers right now that feel more mobile if you are a young person looking at a highly calcified system and saying, I know I'd like to make change through law, but I'm not sure I can right now. You may have heard in the US, we have this thing called the NSA. It would really like to know as much as possible about you. We've made a modicum of progress getting the NSA back in the cage, specifically on spying on American citizens. Almost no progress on getting the NSA to stop spying on other people. But we've actually had huge breakthroughs in cryptography lately. And if you're as pissed off about this as I am, pick up your phone, download Signal. It's what I use when I'm in touch with people who are working in the crypto field. It's the only thing Edward Snowden uses. It's really good. And it actually makes it much, much harder for security services to intercept your communications. It doesn't deal with the metadata problem, but it substantially raises the stakes. The people who wrote Signal were very much being civic. They may not have been being political, but they had a change that they wanted to make. And by putting that code in the world, they found a way to make progress on an issue that would have been hard to make progress on legislatively. Let's go into the realm of billionaires. The person who I think is most likely to have a serious impact on climate change, at least in the US, is probably Elon Musk, as someone who has now figured out how to make electric cars not only widely available, but sexy as hell. And he's going to make a fortune in the process. And you know what? That's great because our Congress has not been able to get together and make significant action around climate change. And so someone who can figure out how to use a market-based force to do this, fantastic. Let's go with it. The stuff that I really study, the stuff that I'm most excited about are the people who try to make norms-based change. And right now in the US, the most interesting thing going on around this is Black Lives Matter. So here is a situation in which legal changes may help matters. It may help to get body cameras on police. It certainly would help to restructure many of our police departments. But this is not a purely legal problem. It has been illegal to kill unarmed black people for quite some time in the United States right now. But the real problem is a problem of social norms. We have deep-set endemic racism in the United States where young black men are usually viewed as a threat. And that pattern has to change over time, and actually dealing with this racial disparity is going to have to deal with that. You see Black Lives Matter do things that look very subtle, but are actually very powerful. When Michael Brown was killed and left out in the sun for 4 hours, you saw people look at the media coverage of his death. The media stories about his death featured a photo where he's shot from below, he looks big, he looks badass, he looks tough. Activists took this photo, found another photo of him on his Facebook feed where he's looking at the camera, he's looking straight at it, and he said, this is a kid. He's got chubby cheeks. He looks shy. And they asked the question, if they gunned me down, which picture would they use? This became a nationwide movement within 3 days. You had thousands of people posting photos of themselves looking dangerous and threatening and looking completely innocent. 3 days later, it's on the front page of the New York Times, a half-page article about this unconscious, endemic racism in media coverage of unarmed black death. And it's really hard to find that first photo of Michael Brown. So what I want to say is this. There's some chunk of people who are going to be engaged with the sort of reforms we've been talking about in this room. They're going to try to change electoral systems. They're going to try to get more people involved with politics. They're going to try to use new technology. God bless these people. And like Godspeed to you, more strength. But there's somewhere between 5 and 55% of people in the US at least, your mileage may vary in different countries, who just aren't having it. And they're gone. And if your job is to say, come back into politics, you're too late. But we don't have to lose these people from civics. They don't have to be bystanders. It's possible that we can look at other forms of participation and social engagement that makes it possible for these folks who in many ways have given up on these institutions, who so badly mistrust them, to make effective change and over time likely build the institutions that end up inheriting some power.
I appreciate a lot your optimism. what I think is, though, that looking at other countries, but also looking at the United States, it is true that there has been a rhetoric also in social movements against politics, because politics was understood as institutional politics. But at the same time, it is true that a very recent phenomenon, totally unexpected by social movement scholars, among others, but I think also party politics scholars, is the fact that under some circumstances, young people have been very much involved in politics, even in a type of politics that we didn't expect them to be interested in. Corbyn in the Labour. It was groups of student activists who have been supporting this. Sanders, apparently, it was a lot of young people thinking there is opportunities for changing also the system. Podemos is another example. When the political system is perceived as potentially changeable, hopes emerge, and these activists seems to be also very young and very optimistic about their own capacity. So I see the watch, and I think we are moving to the next and last sessions, but maybe a plea for a next round of frontiers of democracy. Let's see, going beyond the expectations of the past, seeing also what happens when the civics and the political come together again. So thank you very much.
One moment. My role is primarily to thank our distinguished panelists and all of our participants. But as usual, since I've now hosted 5 of these conferences, I can't resist making a few final comments of my own, which are also a distillation in some respects of what I have picked up here. This has really been an extraordinary conference, I think, and dealing with what I said at the very outset is a kind of an ironic subject, the idea that we would choose the topic making democracy work at the very day when, as Ethan says, the senators are sitting in the US Congress to try to get the vote to decide on something as basic as gun control after a terrible murders, and also when the Brexit vote is taking place and we don't, of course, know what the result is. But I think this has been an extremely positive outcome of a very, very difficult subject. And I thought what I would do in conclusion is to pick up in a bit on Ethan's challenge, which is this is really not about politics, it's about civics and the demand that's being made, and I think this is a strong demand being felt in so many ways in so many places around the world for certain basic values that resonate in a democratic context, but which really have to be the underlying values for any sort of transformation. I think these are the values, if I may say, Intisar, that I think you talked about indirectly in terms of what's going on right now in Tunisia, which is very inspiring. So let me just try my hand at them. I listed 5. You could probably list others, or you could combine some of these and see what you think. I think the first demand is for dignity. Dignity. People want dignity in their lives. They want to be able to be recognized for whom they are. They don't want some large force to be telling them what to do, or somebody who is stronger than they to tell them what to do. They want dignity. And some of this comes from the transformation of the world that we're in that is more technologically savvy and in much more communication. People know that they deserve dignity. Dignity these are universal values, I think. Second is equality. And equality here I don't mean full formal equality, but they demand something that is going to equalize their circumstances and give them the dignity they deserve when they see this growing enormous inequality that is so much affecting the world today. This is certainly driving, as Ethan said, the campaign of Sanders in the U.S. But it's certainly just one example of that. The third, I think, is identity. People want to have an identity. They are members of a community. They're members of a family. They're members of a nation. And I think we often tend to forget that there is a demand for kind of national and community identity, if we may call it that, which of course is a lot of what comes out of the social movements that have been so eloquently described in the conference here today. Fourth, I think people want autonomy, which is really about rights and about the autonomy to be able to make their own decisions, whether it's the right of a woman to control her own body, or the right of someone to exercise political activities on their own behalf. But these are rights. They're recognized. They're, of course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and many covenants that go along with those that are very much part of that. And then the fifth, which is a bit of a problem because it's kind of pushing back in the other direction, is people want security. They want security certainly of their own person and their own family and their own community, and they can be manipulated sometimes to be fearful of what's happening beyond that if they aren't given some basic security within that framework. So with that in mind, I'm now going to just make one final point, which is I was searching my memory for some example of where there may have been in recent history a democratic transformation of the kind that we're talking about in circumstances that are equally problematic. In fact, I think maybe in some ways even more so. And that is the 1930s. I mean, we've talked about the 1930s here largely in terms of Europe and what happened in Europe and how the democratic process produced a terrible set of totalitarian regimes and, of course, the Holocaust. But we also hear, oddly, and as an American I think I can look there, we can look at the United States for a very different example. Because what we had in the 1930s in the United States were the three elements, Philippe, that you talked about. We had a combination of ideology, justification, and agency to transform. What did we have? We had an agent who was democratically elected, President Roosevelt. We had a justification, which was a catastrophic set of economic circumstances that were affecting the whole world, but certainly affecting the United States far worse than it has ever been affected economically today or at any other point. And then we had an ideology, which was democracy. And democracy with a framework, constitution, and separation of powers and all the various elements that the United States has as a democracy, all of which are seriously problematic today, as we've talked about, in terms of their functioning. But at that time, they functioned quite well. They were pushed to the edges. There were situations in which Roosevelt was criticized for pushing too hard, for example, in the Supreme Court, where he tried to change the composition of the court, and rightly was criticized for doing that. But in any event, the point is that a combination of those three elements, ideology, justification, and an agent, allowed a democratic process to essentially save itself. And that's quite literally what happened, I think, in the United States in the 1930s. This is not to wave a national flag for Roosevelt or a party flag for the Democrats in that period. This is a long time ago. It's so long ago that maybe it's not relevant. But it's not so long ago that we shouldn't think about it, because it showed, in some ways, to get back to the example of Tunisia that was put before us so well this morning, how in a time of great stress and disruption, democratic change can happen. It is much more problematic, I think, in a time when, as Philippe and others have been saying, you know, things are so complex and moving so fast, and they're so difficult that they don't seem to be disruptive, or they're in Western countries which are seen to be purely democratic. So I come away from this conference quite optimistic about the prospects that if we go all the way back to the first principles and recognize what people really are demanding, and more so today than ever, then I think these systems can work. But I take your challenge. There should be a whole new set of Frontiers of Democracy conferences. And I can tell you my successor, Michael Ignatieff, is excited about this. So you'll probably hear from him, and we will continue this wonderful process. So thank everyone for coming, and thank you all.